It's my great pleasure to introduce Betsy Schmidt as part of our speaker series. We had originally invited her in, let me get this right, March of 2020, just as the COVID crisis was exploding and had to cancel her visit. We're happy that we were able to reschedule, even if we remain remote. And so Betsy is a professor of emeritus at Loyola University in Maryland, I believe the first Loyola in the US. She earned her Ph.D. in African history in 1987 from UW-Madison, I believe with a dissertation on Southern Rhodesia and women, but has since focused quite extensively on Francophone Africa as well. And so she taught various courses on Africa past and present, colonization in Africa, women in Africa, and she has a truly impressive record of research accomplishments, multiple books, including a 2013 book published by Cambridge University Press on foreign intervention in Africa. She has numerous articles in top flight journals, and so Journal of African History, American Historical Review. And I just wanted to flag before I hand the microphone over that her research is of unusually, I think, deep interdisciplinary interest, not just to historians, but also to political scientists, to foreign policy specialists, and to those who think about international security issues and problems. And so please join me in welcoming her to Africa at Noon.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Jason, for the nice introduction, and to everyone in the African Studies program who helped to facilitate my coming to Madison, at least virtually. I'm very excited to be here. I really hope to be there in person, but I do understand the constraints. So this is far better than not coming at all. As Jason mentioned, I was originally scheduled to come in March 2020 to a conference that was celebrating 60 years of African independence with a focus on Francophone Africa. And so I had written an earlier version of this talk for that conference. And the conference was initially postponed and then canceled altogether. And then we were given the opportunity to come to the African Youth Seminar, which I jumped at. And so here I am. And hopefully I'll get to come in person again someday soon. But my talk today, I'll share the screen right here. My talk today is based on one of the books that I've written recently on foreign intervention in Africa after the Cold War. And I want to talk a little bit about what motivated me to write that book, and what I hope its intent will be, and the audience I hope to reach. So in the aftermath of World War II, African populations in France's overseas territories mobilized for political reforms in the empire and eventually for complete political independence. Despite the formality of state sovereignty, France continued to treat Africa as its privileged domain, as its backyard, much like the United States treated Latin America, signing military cooperation agreements with its former colonies and engaging in more than 36 military interventions in 16 African countries during the first 3 decades of independence. This presentation focuses on a recent iteration of this pattern, France's 2013 intervention in Mali, to quell a secessionist movement and infiltration by violent extremists, which undermined an African-led initiative, intensified the jihadi insurgency, and contributed to widespread destabilization in the region. My presentation encapsulates observations made in my 2018 book. You see the cover right here, Foreign Intervention in Africa After the Cold War, Sovereignty, Responsibility, and the War on Terror. And the earlier volume that Jason mentioned, which is Foreign Intervention in Africa from the Cold War to the War on Terror, that focuses on the decolonization and Cold War periods. Now, the purpose of both books, which are really not based on my own primary research, they're syntheses that bring together the research and make a new argument, But the premise or the hope of the book was to challenge popular myths in the mainstream media, and which tend to ignore the role of foreign actors in current African crises. To outsiders, the word Africa often conjures up images of a continent in crisis, riddled with war and corruption, imploding from disease and starvation, and Africans are regularly blamed for their plight. I argue instead that many of the predicaments that plague Africa today are not solely the result of African decisions, but also the consequence of foreign intrusion into African affairs. And in this way, I feel that the case of Mali is emblematic. So first, although I'm mentioning Mali, let's see. Here we go. I want to move first to Libya, which does not even border Mali, but where events in Libya had a major impact on what later transpired in Mali. Now, this episode in Libya began in the aftermath of the Arab Spring of 2011-2012, when the Muammar Gaddafi regime in Libya was overthrown by Libyan insurgents supported by a foreign military intervention. During the Cold War, Libyan strongman Muammar Gaddafi governed through family, clan, and tribal ties. He promoted social cleavages to keep potential rivals weak and destroyed any institution that might challenge him. Gaddafi's anti-imperialist rhetoric, his regime's nationalization of the Western-dominated oil industry, and their support for African and Arab insurgencies led his isolation from the West. After the Cold War, however, Libya and Western countries found common cause in their mutual hostility toward extremist organizations that embraced violent jihad. Determined to end Libya's pariah status and to benefit from renewed foreign investment in the oil industry, Gaddafi began to cooperate with the West on counterterrorism issues. He renounced terrorism, destroyed biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons stockpiles, and abandoned Libya's weapons of mass destruction programs. UN and EU embargoes and US economic sanctions were lifted, and France and other Western countries began to invest heavily in Libyan oil and natural gas exploration and production. France also supplied Libya with weapons and military aircraft. However, in February 2011, inspired by the Arab Spring uprising in the region and elsewhere, Libyan protesters began an all-out rebellion against the Gaddafi regime. Gaddafi's foreign allies quickly abandoned him. As the Libyan military turned its apparatus against civilians and rebel strongholds, France rallied the UN Security Council to authorize a NATO-led military intervention spearheaded by France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. This was ostensibly to protect civilian lives, but regime change was an unofficial objective. In October 2011, a French warplane and a US Predator drone fired on Gaddafi's convoy, allowing Libyan rebels to capture, brutalize, and execute the former ruler. Without governmental or civil society institutions to fill the power vacuum, regime change prompted the collapse of much of the social order. Gaddafi's departure unleashed violent retribution and score settling by groups set against one another during his rule. Local militias, warlords, and violent extremists seized weapons from his unprotected stockpiles or absorbed his crack desert troops, which included Tuaregs from Mali and Niger, as well as mercenaries who hailed from impoverished Sahelian nations, including Mali, Niger, Chad, and Sudan. So here you see Mali, and that's what I'm going to focus on next. After Gaddafi's ouster, weapons and fighters streamed across the borders into northern Mali, where Tuareg pastoralists had long faced discrimination, repression, and neglect by the southern-based government in Bamako. Tuareg grievances had led to numerous conflicts in the past, but the addition of thousands of Libyan-trained Tuareg fighters and their sophisticated weapons added a new dimension. By April 2012, in late 2011, a Tuareg secessionist movement, the National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad, MNLA, declared independence and embarked on the conquest of northern Mali. The secession sparked a military coup in the south, led by a US-trained army officer. By April 2012, the MNLA had gained control of 2/3 of the country. Nearly broke, it formed an alliance with Ansar Dine, a newly formed jihadist group that was closely aligned with Al-Qaeda. Although France had supported previous Tuareg rebellions in Mali, hoping that the secular insurgencies would help drive Al-Qaeda militants from the region, it quickly learned that it could not control them. This time, it opposed the secessionist movement. In October 2012, France and the Economic Community of West African States, that is ECOWAS, pushed for UN intervention to stop the secession, to expel the jihadis, and to reunite the country. Although it was silent about its economic interests, France was cognizant of the untapped uranium deposits in the territory controlled by the insurgents, as well as Mali's considerable oil reserves. In December 2012, the UN Security Council endorsed an ECOWAS intervention plan that is an African-led mission comprising troops from ECOWAS and other African countries. The European Union agreed to provide 400 officers led by a French commander to train the Malian troops. But provoked by the threat of foreign intervention, Ansar Dine and its Al-Qaeda associates launched a southward advance. Mali's new military government appealed to France for assistance. Casting aside the African-led international plan that had been months in the making, France embarked on a unilateral military intervention dubbed Operation Serval in January 2013. As French troops landed, French warplanes attacked jihadi training camps, weapons depots, and other positions throughout the north. Foreign powers that had initially supported the multilateral proposal switched their allegiance to the French operation. Ansar Dine and Al-Qaeda responded to the French intervention with a second southward advance. 2/3 of the country was now under their control, and they were even closer to the capital than they had been before the French intervention. France increased its troop strength, and President François Hollande promised that French forces would remain in Mali until they had halted the jihadi offensive. Extremist fighters were captured, killed, or forced out of the country, and the capital was secured. And this is a group of the soldiers who had joined the French-led Operation Serval and the African mission AFISMA in April 2013. By the end of January, French and Canadian troops, supplemented by other African personnel, had driven the insurgents from several northern cities and towns. Forced into remote rural areas and across territorial boundaries, they began to target unprotected civilian populations rather than Malian and foreign security forces. On April 25th, the UN Security Council retroactively endorsed the French military operation. The same resolution vested a new UN mission with the power to protect Malian civilians and UN personnel and to help Mali's unelected governing authorities establish state administration and stability throughout the country. It also empowered French forces to intervene in support of that mission. Despite the large French and UN military presence, the northern insurgencies continued. By May 2014, the MNLA had regained control of much of northern Mali, and once again, France responded militarily. In August 2014, Paris initiated Operation Barkhane, a counterterrorism program that was intended to counter extremists from Mauritania to Chad. Headquartered in Chad, the operation included a permanent deployment of more than 3,000 French soldiers, which was raised to 4,000 in 2017, as well as contingents from Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger. And you can see here a picture of French Operation Barkhane personnel speaking with the Malian elder, and you can see the relationship, the type of relationship they had with one another. While France and the United States focused on counterterrorism, Algeria brokered a peace accord under UN auspices. We'll stop the share here. The International Crisis Group charged that the accords, written primarily by international mediators, had been imposed from outside and emphasized foreign security agendas rather than local interests. External powers had prioritized the establishment of law, order, and stability, focusing on the end of the Tuareg rebellion so that the Malian military and international forces could turn their attention to the jihadist insurgency. Local groups, in contrast, were concerned about the militarized political and economic system and the lack of social services, employment, justice, and political autonomy in the north. Although these structural issues were at the source of the conflict, the 2015 agreements did not adequately address them. A further weakness of the 2015 accords was their failure to include all parties to the conflict, including newer jihadi organizations. As Al-Qaeda and its associates adapted to new circumstances, the Islamic State also found an opening in Mali. Military coups in 2020 and 2021, led by army officers trained in the United States, France, and Germany. The coups followed months of protest by civil society activists who accused the civilian government of corruption, of mismanagement of the economy, and of failure to quell extremist violence in the rural areas. In the rural areas, civilians were being killed both by extremists and government forces. After taking power, the military governments, like the civilian governments they ousted, sidelined the civil society opposition. France accepted the military ouster of the failed civilian government in 2020. The military leaders who took power endorsed French military presence and banned popular protests against French involvement. The protests had been sparked by horrific civilian death tolls documented by the UN that had resulted from French airstrikes, as well as war crimes committed by the Malian military and local militias, and which were supported by French intervention forces. French troops in Mali were seen as occupiers, not protectors, and survivors and those whose families had been victims of French and Malian forces began to turn in increasing numbers to extremist organizations. After the 2021 coup, which ousted French allies, Paris announced its plan to withdraw 5,000 troops from Mali. Mali, meanwhile, shifted its attention to Russian private military companies, which are really mercenaries. The group it turned to was the Wagner Group, which is notorious for its human rights violations in other African countries. Playing the Russian card, Mali may be calling France's bluff, hoping to halt its retreat, or it may be seeking a replacement partner, which may attract US attention as well as that of Belgium and Germany. In 2021, 8 years after the French intervention, Mali remains in turmoil. The security situation is actually worse than it was in 2013. Much of the North continues to suffer from the lack of a functioning government and basic social services. So I want to conclude that the 2013 French-led military intervention in Mali not only failed to bring peace to the region, it instead contributed to a spiraling cycle of violence and instability. Ignoring the grievances and desires of affected populations, It intensified extremist violence in Mali and propelled the turbulence into neighboring countries. The French action exemplifies the way in which, despite the formality of state sovereignty, France has continued to treat Africa as its privileged domain. Three factors account for French failures. First, the French-led intervention brought short-term gains, but did not attempt to produce long-term solutions that would resolve underlying grievances. Second, the French-backed Mali government, which seized power in a military coup, made no serious effort to address the root causes of the conflict or to provide essential governmental and social services in the conflict areas. As a result, local populations, historically neglected by corrupt governments that were supported by France and other external powers, and abused by police, customs officials, and security forces, have had little reason to support externally driven law and order initiatives that will likely expose them to retaliation by extremists and threaten the underground economy that enables them to survive. Third, the solutions are not military. They will not be quick, and they cannot be imposed from above or from outside. Peace accords that cater to foreign interests and corrupt governments that are unaccountable to the people cannot produce lasting peace. Underlying grievances must be addressed and remedied, and this can only happen if the affected people, ordinary men, women, youth, and their civil society institutions, have a major role in peace negotiations and settlements from beginning to end. So I thank you very much, and I've left lots of time for questions, which I find people often enjoy most about these sessions. So I thought maybe more than 10 minutes will be something that you'd appreciate. So thank you again.
Well, that was a really interesting talk, Betsy, and actually I think it was quite provocative too in some ways that we can talk about. And so I'm in charge, I suppose, of moderating Q&A. I certainly have questions, but I'd like to defer to the audience, at least initially. And so if you'd raise your hand, I will call on you. And hopefully I will see your hand. If your hand is raised and I don't respond, let me just speak up.
I think Jacqueline had one about women's roles.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I can't see hands up on mine for some reason.
Oh, she put it in the Q&A.
Oh, okay. Can you just answer that then?
Yes, she asked me about women's role in the peace processes, and they have been really critical, as they are in many African and global South countries, and really, quite frankly, all over the world, because they are the mothers of the children often who are being killed or who are being included into the violent extremist organizations. And so they do put enormous pressure on the government. They insist on having a role at the bargaining table. They're often among the first to be excluded, that and the jihadi organizations, where people say, well, we are not going to talk to terrorists. Well, if you don't talk to the people who are engaged in these processes, you're not going to get very far if you just exclude them. And so women have been really pivotal, and all kinds of studies have shown that they have their ear to the ground. They have connections with lots of people. They have social networks that can be employed, and that it's a serious mistake to exclude them.
And so Martin, your hand is up. Martin Klein. Can you unmute? There we go.
You did again.
I'm sorry, this is the first time I have moderated, and so I am not used to being on this side of things. Aaliyah, if I'm doing something wrong here and calling on people, or help me out.
I don't think so. I think Martin maybe is having a hard time with their audio. Martin, would you like to type your question into the Q&A box? Because we're having a difficulty hearing you. I see a question from Abel in the Q&A box. What do you think about recent, here, I'll let you take this from here. Betsy, can you see this?
Oh, okay, I'll look at it just a second. What do you think about the recent Montpellier summit where Macron gathered African youth to reinvigorate France Afrique? What would be the impact of the Chadian president Déby's death and the military power in Chad? Ooh, okay. I know that there's been a lot of criticism in Africa of the Montpellier summit and just feeling like it's more window dressing and lip service to African youth. And, you know, we shall see. I mean, certainly France has been making claims since 1990 that, you know, democratization is very important for the continuation of the partnerships. And, you know, as you know, when push comes to shove and their security and economic interests are at stake, they quickly toss that to the side and, you know, support governments that have come to power through military coups and, you know, throw in thousands of French troops and vow to stay until it's over. And, you know, it remains to be seen if this will be any different. In terms of Déby's death, that, you know, the same system is in place, so he's gone, but his people are still in power. They work very closely with France. They're extremely repressive to their own populations, and, you know, have been engaged in human rights abuses in countries where they've intervened. They've had a role in Central African Republic and in Darfur, you know, engaging in pretty awful practices. So again, I'm not sure that I see his death as making a great deal of difference as long as those structures remain as they were. You know, we saw the same thing in Zimbabwe when Mugabe died, that, you know, his people stepped into the breach. So unfortunately, I don't necessarily see this as a turning point on the horizon.
Okay, wonderful. I think we have Aliko Sangalo next with his hand up, and there's a Q&A box. I just realized there was a Q&A box. Open that up and you can see the questions as well.
Okay.
Shall I go ahead?
Yes, go ahead, Aliko.
Yes. Thank you very much, Betsy, for bringing us up to date with Mali. As you know, for quite some time, Mali was considered as one of the most democratic countries in Africa. They had regular elections. And so until the series of coups began, Mali was an exemplary country. Mm-hmm. I was quite impressed, I should say, with the speech of the Prime Minister of Mali at the UN when he publicly took on France and you know, protested a whole list of things that France was doing. And then they summoned the French ambassador, I mean, back home. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs summoned the French ambassador, which is a gesture of, you know, great independence, if you will, if not rebellion. And France, of course, as you said, you know, they're going to pull out their troops. But how far are they pulling them out? Mm-hmm. I don't think they're going back to France. I think they are nearby. And the intervention from Western countries continues. Now, I wonder if you can tell us what the role of the US is, because now after Afghanistan, the next place is really the Sahel in general, but Mali in particular. How is France and the US and other countries, Great Britain, especially Western countries, cooperating among them to keep Mali in their hands. And that's one side. The other side is the Wagner mercenaries that you talked about. They're also in Central African Republic. How is this going to, I should say, will this not really increase tensions rather than, cool them down?
Yes, I'll thank you, Aliko. I'll start with the last part first. I think it will increase, and it has increased tensions, and it's likely to slow down the departure of France and maybe the United States. So it does throw a wrench into the works, and it's sort of like the Cold War again coming to Africa. And just as the U.S. is so concerned about what China's doing, what China's getting, the opportunities that it's taking from what the U.S. sees as its privileged domain and France sees as its privileged domain. I also agree that withdrawing troops from Mali doesn't mean they're going back to France. Just as the U.S. saying that it's withdrawing from Somalia, well, it's lodging its troops now in Kenya and in other neighboring countries or Djibouti, ready to invade again if they see fit. So I think France will continue to keep deployment forces in neighboring countries, and there are several that are willing to cooperate with that. So again, that's why I wonder how much of this summit is just PR, that not a lot will really change on the ground in reality. So again, it remains to be seen, but history doesn't bode well for this kind of thing. It's happened time and time again, and Libya was a pariah until it could be helpful and agreed to stop migrants, in Libya and put them to work in slave labor camps rather than let them cross the Mediterranean into Europe. And they were paid a whole lot of money to do that by the European Union before Gaddafi was ousted. And then, we now see what's happening to the migrants and how they're treated. So, enemies can become friends when they're useful, and then they become enemies again when it becomes politically expedient. I think the Russian presence will be an issue. Thank you. I see that Marty's question is there now. Should I answer that, Jason?
Yeah. Can I consolidate just two of the other ones?
Yeah, sure.
Well, and so so the question by Leif and Abel, I think point to what I found arguably provocative in your presentation. And so if I can just be sort of devil's advocate here, and ask you, to maybe go into a bit more detail as to what role you envision for France in terms of the long-term solutions. And so my reaction to your talk was that the whole regime of cooperation has been so degraded over the years that what France can do is really limited largely to military interventions that are themselves unable to address sort of the longer-term structural, economic, social problems that are driving the underlying stability. And so, I mean, is one implication of your talk that we should actually strengthen the role of France in the region, or should we follow Abel's advice and withdraw entirely? And if that's the solution, why would we expect things to get better? And so, what is your counterfactual hypothetical? Is it more of France, or is it less of France?
Well, I guess I would say it needs to be less of France in supporting corrupt, mismanaged governments that oppress their own people and don't have any accountability and operate with impunity. And that is not going to be productive or helpful to anyone. It's going to be very counterproductive. It's going to drive more people to extremist organizations, more people underground, and all kinds of research has shown this. So that obviously is not the solution. Whether or not France would be willing to invest the same amount of money in disinterested help, in the interest of humanity and the right thing to do, and as reparations for past colonial practices, I think that's doubtful. Most powers don't do that. The United States doesn't do that. And so I really do think that in many ways, African countries would be better off if France disengaged. I mean, the African populations, maybe not the elites who are running the governments, but the populations at the grassroots would be better off without France's role there. And the question is, how do they get protection while this process is going on? And, you know, will neighboring African states be any better, or do they also have their own interests that they want to promote in these areas at the expense of Malians or people in the Central African Republic or Darfur, et cetera? And, you know, research also shows that, you know, African neighbors can also be exploitative and self-interested. Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance. So there aren't any easy solutions, but what we do know is what doesn't work. And so I think, you know, the first thing is to not continue doing harm. And then while we're doing that, to try to work on, but then what can we do that might be productive? And how do we support these grassroots initiatives? And how do we support the civil society institutions that are trying to get a seat at the bargaining table and, you know, change attitudes in the rural areas? And what kind of resources do they need to do this? You know, how we can work with them, you know, with or without the government sanction, that's another question. I mean, you can't just go in and start supporting groups if the government says you can't. So it's very tricky terrain. But I'd say first we need to do no harm.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So Martin asks about the role of US intelligence operations in the Sahel and the extension of jihadist activities to the full bay of central Mali. And so do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can't tell you much about the role of US intelligence operations, but I do know that the extension of jihadi activity to the full bay really plays on, well, it's a conflict that really is the result of horrific climate change, that there is a real dearth of water and arable land, and the desert is encroaching. And we do know that Lake Chad is drying up, which has affected Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, and is the heart of the Boko Haram insurgency in nearby Nigeria. Similarly, the Sahara is moving further and further south. The extremists are playing on this conflict between the hunters and the herders, the herders and the farmers, who happen to be of different ethnic groups as well. And so people are being targeted as Fulani, but the real issue is they're the herders that are competing for water with the farmers. And again, these are people whose needs have not been addressed by the Tuareg secessionists, nor by the Bamako government in the south. And so when the jihadis offer them social services, offer them a source of income, usually in the illicit economy, smuggling people or drugs or cigarettes or et cetera, they do it because they're desperate. They have no other opportunities, and they get some kind of protection, law and order from the extremists that they weren't getting from the government. That's what, you know, one of the reasons for the spread of jihadist activity, that they're finding groups that have been discriminated against and targeting them for recruitment.
So Bright would like you to explain France's interest in regime change in Libya, given their prior support for Gaddafi's regime. What was going on there?
Okay. Well, I think they just saw the writing on the wall that this man was going, and you know, the insurgents were fairly strong, and the civilian opposition was quite strong, and they wanted to be on the winning side of history. And so they abandoned him. And again, you know, just I think, you know, Saddam Hussein had seen that beforehand, that, you know, you're useful as long as you're useful, and then you'll be left in the lurch. And Mobutu saw the same thing. Cold War is over. We don't need you anymore. Siad Barre in Somalia saw the same thing. Suddenly, discovery of his human rights abuses that we really knew about all along. And so when it was clear that Gaddafi did not have the support or the control of his people, the U.S. and Europe were ready to negotiate with the people they felt were coming to power, and that was the insurgents. And thoughts of Obama's statement that Libya was the worst mistake of his presidency. Yeah, I mean, he joined really a minority group in his administration in calling for U.S. involvement in the military intervention with France. It was a campaign that was spearheaded by Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, by Susan Rice, and by Samantha Power. Susan Rice on the National Security Council, and Samantha Power at the UN. So interestingly, by three very powerful women in the foreign policy establishment who could be termed humanitarian interventionists, that they want to intervene militarily, but they want to do it to protect innocent civilians. And the problem there was they really just didn't understand Libya, its history, what Gaddafi had done, the destruction of the civil society institutions, the fact that there would be a power vacuum, that there are all these rivals, that are ready to go at each other's throats as soon as they don't have the Gaddafi regime standing on their necks. And so they didn't foresee the kind of pandemonium that would break out, and no provisions were really made. The U.S. is really bad at, post-ouster measures, as we saw in Afghanistan, as we saw in Iraq, as we saw in Libya. And Obama's his Defense Department, the Vice President, much of the foreign policy establishment had warned him against getting involved. And he weighed all the options, and he went with Clinton, Rice, and Power, and Samantha Powers, and endorsed this, and then in retrospect realized it was a horrible mistake. So
Marissa typed a really, I think, deep and complex question in just a few sentences. I'm asking you to talk about the well, I guess what's driving the series of military interventions, but I think what's really interesting is why military interventions have been coupled with pressure for ballot box democracy. And so I wonder if you could talk about what you see as the what's the best way to sort of couple or sequence actions designed to promote stability with support for democratization over the long term? Are we doing it wrong? Are we trying to do too much at once?
yeah.
Focusing on ballot box democracy itself destabilizing in a way that the West finds difficult to admit.
Right. Yeah, I mean, just having elections when you have no security, you've got a repressive government in power, you've got war all around you, there are no real political parties, civil society institutions, and people are supposed to go to the polls and vote their conscience. And, people are petrified to do that. They don't think anything is going to change. And, it's the people from the hometown or with good connections to elites who win. And it doesn't really bring about democracy. It just brings about more of the same. But the United States and other Western powers are very much wedded to these Western forms and don't seem to understand this or don't want to understand this. So that's all a country really has to do, is to hold these elections, whether or not they're legitimate or can stand the test of time. And then they get the resources that they want, that now it's not a military government anymore, it's a civilian government. We can resume our military aid. We won't be violating the Leahy Amendment that prohibits military aid to governments that came to power in coups. So it's just really I think a front to allow outside powers to get back involved militarily and yet say that we're being decent and democratic. Resources, I think resources do have something to do with it. certainly, as I mentioned, France is well aware of the uranium reserves under the insurgent territories in Niger and Mali. It's aware of the oil and natural gas potential of these countries. There's the fear that, you know, China will get a hold of them, or Russia will get a hold of them. And, you know, in this battle for resources, you know, as we undergo this horrible climate change and energy crisis, is a serious one. There is a commitment to Western political and military hegemony. The whole neocon argument that we are exceptional, that we have the model, that we can show the way, is sort of arrogance of power, that we have all the answers, and therefore an unwillingness to listen to people at the grassroots who really do know what's going on. So I think it's a combination of factors. I don't think you can say it's any one thing, but it's very much wrapped up in the history of U.S. and French interventions in the recent past.
Betsy, you mentioned control of resources, and I know in the Wagner Group stuff, Le Monde Diplomatique has done some really great reporting on their operations and Russian influence in the Central African Republic, where the Russian government or linked groups have entered into very favorable contracts with central authorities for control over natural resources, uranium, that kind of thing. Are we seeing in Mali the same kind of use of military intervention to seize sort of legal and formal control over business relationships, natural resources, concessions, that kind of thing?
I don't know that we've seen it yet, but I see that as, you know, in the future, and that this is what France did after the countries got political independence, that they made sure that they had these nice economic cooperation agreements that guaranteed their access as if they were still the imperial power, and kept out other interests, that this was still France's protected domain. I imagine that that's what they would like to do. That's certainly what China's trying to do in various African countries. And you know, the U.S., as I said, is feeling uneasy because they feel that this is something that they should be able to do, not China. Yeah. So I do think that locking these countries into long-term contracts for provision of resources is important.
Aliko's hand is up. Can we unmute Aliko?
Yes, I'm unmuted. I just wrote in the chat that the invasion of Libya by Western forces has a lot to do with France's personal political relationship with Gaddafi, who not only had financed his campaign, I don't remember what year now, but boasted to have done so. And so Sarkozy was quite furious with him and was determined to get rid of him, and persuaded the NATO forces to join him in invading Libya.
Oh,
That's what they want. The second observation I want to make has to do with the Sahel in general, because if you look at Mali, you have to look at the countries next door, Niger, Chad, and so forth. And the big fear is that all those jihadists who have been ousted elsewhere will end up in the Sahel. And indeed, beyond the Sahel, in northern Mozambique, in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, and so forth. So I think the forces of, I don't know, at least opposition are going up rather than going down. And I'm afraid that there's going to be all kinds of excuses to try to suppress any nascent democracies in the Sahel for sure, but it could be also further afield.
Right, that might protest, you know, the French and foreign involvement. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I agree. I mean, I think it looks pretty bleak, despite the proclamations to the contrary. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah.
What possibility, Betsy, do you see for ECOWAS to play a more robust role in situations like this?
Well, I mean, they were sidelined. I mean, they were involved in negotiations. The African Union and ECOWAS were involved in these long-term plans for an African-led initiative, and France just barged in 2013 and said, "Guys, you know, you're too slow. We're taking over." And the UN did then what it had also done in Rwanda. It retroactively endorsed French intervention. Similarly, when Kenya invaded Somalia, the UN retroactively endorsed Kenyan intervention or Ethiopian intervention. So, you know, African initiatives are fine, but they're often not recognized when it's not convenient and shunted aside. And another problem is the national interests of some of the countries that get involved with their neighbors. You know, as I've mentioned before, Rwanda's interest in the Eastern Congo. You know, many countries interested in the wealth of Sudan. You know, the water, the oil, etc. So that it's really important that the groups that send intervention forces not be from countries that have these vested interests in one party or the other winning out, or in prolonging the conflict so that corrupt practices can continue that may be benefiting corrupt government officials or military officials from the troop providing countries. And that's another problem that's happened a lot, where they're doing deals with the violent extremists that they're supposedly trying to oust, but they're all engaged in this illicit economy. So again, it's better to have African involvement, I think, than French involvement, but that is not a panacea, you know, and so again, one has to be wary about that.
So we have about 5 more minutes. If there are any more questions, please type them into the Q&A box. I certainly have a bunch, but I've already asked a bunch.
You're in a privileged position.
I am. Well, and so I will throw one out there, and if nobody else types anything, Aliko has an observation. I'll ask a question. You started with Libya, and so maybe can you close with Libya in the last few minutes? And so how, you know, Aliko pointed us towards thinking about regional constraints and issues and spillovers. Can the problem in Mali be resolved without first solving the problem in Libya? And what are the prospects of that, given meddling from all sides, including, you know, Turkey, but also from the old powers in Europe?
Yeah, that's the problem. I mean, we really, you know, in overthrowing Gaddafi, really unleashed turmoil all over the Sahel. And that could have been anticipated. I mean, it really wasn't hard to envision that. And that's the tragedy of the lack of historical knowledge in this country. And I think France knows better than the United States, but does it anyway. And the US is just really ignorant. You know, they just really sort of assume that everybody wants to be like us. And you know, we pulled out the dictator and suddenly there are democratic free elections. And yeah, I think that, you know, the ongoing war in Libya, the conflicts, the failed peace settlements, again, that have excluded really important actors from the talks, the interests of these outside powers, whether it be Turkey, Russia, you know, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, France, US, they are also at play. And it really requires that problems all over the region be resolved pretty much simultaneously, that working on all these different fronts. You know, Boko Haram and its cross-border issues that affect Niger, Chad, Cameroon, Mali's affecting Burkina Faso. They're all very much interrelated, and the violent extremists are traveling from one territory to another and recruiting people in these territories. So it's very complex. It's going to be very difficult. It's going to take a long time.
So we have I think a final question in the Q&A from Martin Klein, if you can see that, Betsy.
Okay, thank you. And I do agree with Aliko that unfortunately African initiatives often depend on financing from the West. Those who have money will rule the roost. And that's true that many of the elections are paid for by the European Union, et cetera. Yeah. Okay, AT&T was democratically elected. Sorry, AT&T. He was very popular. His regime turned out to be corrupt, but how do you deal with corruption? It is rooted in poverty more than outside intervention. And yes, that's true. We've often seen that it's the richest countries in terms of resources that often have the most corrupt regimes, because of the inequality that spawns, that the people with power, whether they be government or military, are the ones who have access to those resources, and the others are left with nothing. And there has to be, in these countries and in the United States, a more equal distribution of resources, or social unrest is going to continue. And people will be attracted to extremist organizations that offer solutions that may be bad, but maybe not as bad as what the current state is. And so it's really development that's initiated at the grassroots, by the grassroots, but financed by those who support them, so that there will be options other than joining the violent extremists to put food on the table, to get medicine, to get basic social services. And there doesn't seem to be a big move towards this. A lot of lip services paid toward it. But if you look at the disproportion in military funding, say in the US foreign aid budget versus economic funding, development assistance, it's just a phenomenal difference in the figures. So, having American troops dig wells, that's all fine and good, but it's a pittance compared to the harm that they're doing with their military intervention. How do we get people to be less selfish and we don't know that in this country either. I mean, we're struggling with that in this country either. How do we get people to value the common good instead of our own? I want my own freedom to do whatever I want. So it's a worldwide problem, and climate change and the conflicts that's spawning have certainly made this incredibly dire, really dire situation.
Well, it is 1 o'clock and we end early. I want to thank you, Betsy, for a really, we end on time, I should say, not early. Thank you for such a fascinating discussion and a rich discussion on this important issue. I really appreciated it.
Thank you very much. And thank you again for inviting me, and all of you who worked so hard to make this happen, and everyone in the audience for taking time from, I'm sure, our extremely busy schedules to come and participate. I really enjoyed and appreciated it.
We'll see you on campus soon, we hope.
I hope so too.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.